welcome back to the Brandon and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Janis Ward. She received her Ph.D. in IO psychology from the Stevens Institute of Technology, is the founder of her own consulting company, and has tons of experience in the consulting world, which we are very excited to dive in today. Welcome, Janis. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to share.
Yeah, absolutely. You actually met Brandon first, right? 'Cause I don't think I was at the Metro Career Day. Is that where you spoke at first?
Yes, I had been a panelist on that career day. They organized it very nicely in terms of early career panel, then an internal consultant panel, and an external consultant panel. I was on that final panel, and Brad and I were chatting at the cocktail hour afterwards, actually, and that's when this sort of came up. Like, oh wow, sure, I'd be happy to chat if you think people are interested in hearing. So yeah.
Shout out to Jared. Jared introduced us too and said that it would be great to have you on here. So happy we were able to make that happen. So you definitely were really insightful at the Metro Career Day. So I was listening to that and I was like, oh, this would be great content for the podcast too.
So glad to hear it. And it's nice to meet your acquaintance Joe over this Zoom thing we got going on here.
I know I missed out on a fun day. I went to the first one, or our first one during our first year at semester program. It was great. The second one, I don't think I was able to take off work, but I heard that it was. I mean, I remember it was a really great time too. For I guess prospective IO students, they have a annual career day for the Metro Association in New York City, and they have a whole bunch of internal, external panelists. And it's just that, right? Is there professors too? What am I missing out a group?
It's mostly practitioner focused. At least this one was. I think there have been times in the past where they include that sort of academic career perspective, but this one
Yeah.
was all practitioners.
Yeah, I think Brandon says the same thing. Like it was really helpful. Like you get connected with so many different people. We've created long lasting relationships, and now we met you, and now we have this episode. So it all turns out great.
I know, it's great. And a lot of they also, with permission, published our LinkedIn profile connections. And as a result of that, I have 18 new BFF graduate students.
Oh,
Two of them right here.
Oh, come on, goodness.
yeah,
That's right. That's right. I love it. It's good.
yeah. No, absolutely. We're glad we got to met you and get to meet you through Brandon. But to get into the basis of our episode, as we said in the introduction, it seems like you have a long list of consulting experience and just a career in that field. We wanted to start off asking you, because you created or founded your own consulting firm. What led you to do that? Like, what was that journey to starting that?
Great. That's a good question. That's often one that's asked. So, my decision to create my own firm and stay on my own kind of happened organically. Um, I was studying at Stevens, completing my doctoral studies. Once I was done with coursework, you start the dissertation process. That can be a long and winding road, and mine was. Um, However, I did have the luxury of having two of my faculty, Dick Riley as well as Seymour Adler, who had their own consulting firms. And when opportunities would come along, project work, etc., they would often employ their doctoral students to do that. We also were in an unusual situation in that funding was hard to come by for our program at Stevens because it's an engineering school and they didn't always fully understand the merit of what our program was, so the dollars were few and far between. So our wonderful faculty would throw us a bone periodically and give us interesting things to do. Um, so I started working as sort of I would call maybe an adjunct colleague through Seymour's firm very regularly, ASI at the time, um, and doing assessment center work. It still took several years, excuse me, for that degree to be finished. And I actually got really good at pulling together project work, both from them and from other contexts that I had. And by the time I finished, which was 7 years later, I will admit, I said, I've gotten pretty good at this. I wonder if I'd like to try this on my own. So 2 years after I graduated, I founded this tiny little firm called J.M. Ward Consulting. It's a doing business as, it's a specific business structure. I'm a sole proprietorship. And I thought, well, let me give this a try. And here I am 22 years later, still standing. So it really just came out of circumstance, rather than my coming out of school and saying, I'm going to start my firm. No, it just sort of happened in a way that was nice and organic.
Honestly, that's the best way for things to happen, the organic way, because then you know it's real. And shout out to Dr. Adler as well. He teaches adjunct at Hofstra, and hopefully will be coming on this podcast soon as well. We've been in contact with him and met him at SIOP. But Dr. Adler giving you that opportunity is a really cool, I think, thing to hear about as a student, because it is this really interesting relationship that when you're coming up in the field of IO, sometimes like you might create almost like a mentorship type
Mm-hmm.
relationship with somebody who's in the field and like and is a practitioner. When you were kind of in that graduate school experience and you were learning underneath Dr. Adler, were you kind of just soaking in a lot of information? Like, what was the type of work that you were doing when you were doing that?
A lot of the work that I was doing with ASI at that time, the very first engagement I had was practice. You're going to believe how old this idea is. Proctoring paper and pencil tests for a client of theirs who were processing a lot of applicants. I won't say who it was. The company doesn't exist anymore. It's called something else now, but it's a big telecom. Let's just say that. And I would walk up and down the hallways and time the various things that they were doing, and it was just helpful, helpful hands. There were a couple of other things also through Dr. Riley. I did some project work for them too, that were more of maybe a team building nature. Um, Dr. Riley also leveraged some previous work experience I had while I was still a student, and that was to design the performance management system for our school's administrative personnel. So at Stevens Institute of Technology, the president wanted to revamp the performance management system, and I had already done that type of work before coming to Stevens. So we employed me for that, and it also generated some money. So the things that I loved about both Dick and Seymour is that they were really creative. They would think outside of the box to try to leverage the resources they had in us to needs that they saw. Um, and I will tell you, they were also very careful and circumspect about how they utilized their students. It wasn't an automatic given that if you're a doctoral student, you get to go work with these gentlemen. You had to had to prove your worth. You had to have something to offer. Um, and they managed those relationships very carefully because they didn't want it to seem, the word that comes to mind may not be accurate, but it's sort of ancestral that, oh my goodness, the company's getting flooded with all of these doctoral students. What the heck are they going to do with them all? So it was very well thought out. Again, kudos to each of them for doing that and giving us opportunities to practice what we were learning.
That's I feel like what a professor should do, and they did that like very, very well. Like teach you the stuff you have to learn, but then also give you the place to practice and actually get to present what you know. Uh, you talked about that your pathway into creating your own firm, now 22 years later, fruitful and successful. But I bet during those 22 years, there might have been a couple of faults or mistakes. Could you kind of talk to us about like some of the things you've learned along the way that led you to where you are now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, also. Well, as you might imagine, never been a business owner previously, and just 2 years out of my doctoral program, although I was I was older than some of the other students where I'd already had a little bit of a career. But, what the heck do I know about running a business? Nothing. So, um, what I realized I needed to do was get this particular business designation because it seemed to work best for me. I knew I was not necessarily inclined to build a business and hire employees, which, if you're going to do that, you need to be an LLC or an S Corp. I decided this was the route that I wanted to go, but I had to find that out, had to get tax assistance on that. um, you need to figure out, how am I going to manage all this? How am I going to schedule things? It took a number of years, but I came to realize that I actually needed an administrative assistant. Can you imagine that? Fortunately, I had gotten busy enough that I was so busy delivering the work, I didn't have time to bill for it. Stupid, right? But you just get up against it that way. So I did bring on an administrative assistant who works with me remotely and has done for over 15 years. She's still with me. Um, then we had to bring on a bookkeeper. These are the sorts of things that either a person who knows they're starting a business knows they have to have: finance department, admin, all these various things. Nope. I had to build it as I went. Um, and again, it was out of necessity because either the schedule was getting harder for me to juggle and be effective at delivering, hence the administrative assistant, or keeping track of all the expenses. And then at that point, working with a number of different consulting firms, how to keep all of their processes straight, hence the bookkeeper and the tax person. So, anyone else who is interested in trying this sort of path, be mindful that you need other support, other business like support to help you keep moving so that you're free to deliver with your expertise. I was my own IT department until it started falling apart. And then I called on my dear friends who are either super IT people, or my assistant's husband is a fantastic IT guy and he sorts things out for us a lot. So it's really by hook or by crook, you figure these things out. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but that's sort of the things that I learned I needed to have as I was going along.
That's super fair as like a learning when you're trying to start your own firm. Like to think about it and you're like, I can do all this work. I know how to do all this work. And then you're like, well, now I just got a paycheck and like, how do I put this money back into the company? What do I do with it? I think it's a good question to ask. And a question I have to follow up on that is, as somebody who's like started their firm, did you consult with like non-IOs who might have more of a business background to try and gain that knowledge of how to run your own company, or like where did you try to like learn how to do those types of things? Was it just trial by fire?
A combination. I did have, um, as I was saying, I already had a tax accountant as just sort of running my own personal taxes because it already had become more complex than um, I was prepared to do effectively and legally. So he could give me a lot of advice in terms of what the pluses and minuses were for business structure, for example. I also had some conversations with friends of mine who were in the business world um, in terms of what are the sorts of things that I need. I had a really wonderful conversation with a dear friend of mine's husband who's a CPA, and just kind of get a sense of also from a structure perspective, what am I doing? What makes the most sense? Just to kind of get that type of advice. And again, as I mentioned, I have a couple of dear friends um, who are very, very steeped in IT solutions, both from a personal perspective and an enterprise perspective, that could advise me on various things that would make sense for my teeny tiny business. I didn't need a big program, but for example, I have had for many years a Microsoft 365 account in my company name, and it has just 5 little accounts, covers everything we need, but that's how we have our own email accounts.
No, it makes sense. I feel like I really enjoy this type of conversation because especially in like masters and PhD programs, when people start learning about what consulting actually is, you either have the people that are like, no, no way, I'm not going to do that, or you have the people that are like, wow, this is really cool, and which eventually leads to I want to start my own consulting firm. But that whole point that you brought up about actually running the business is, I guess, unless you have some sort of previous experience or maybe it's just something that you really enjoy and you read up upon, you have no knowledge of how to run it, which is a very fair assessment because who would unless you do that sort of research? Um, so those that's like the exact answer that we were looking for from like the mistakes that you learned along the way, because I think it's a very important thing to hear for students who are end up wanting to start their own consulting firm. Um, and now that we know the business side of it, I wanted to ask you now more like the skills sides of it. Uh, what are those like top skills you think students would need to know to work in consulting or have their own consulting firm, whether it's like data skills or 360 feedback skills, or maybe even like client facing skills?
Yeah. Um, Almost all of the above. However, the first thing that comes to mind is you must have a deep expertise from your IO personnel psych training as table stakes. That's your offering, right? Either your data management, your big data skills, your data analytics, this is something that you would have as an offering. Um, I had deep knowledge of leadership, what makes for effective leadership, both from my training as well as from the work that I had been doing. Um, so that's sort of, you really have to have an offering. And they always say it has to be a unique offering. Well, it may not have to be all that unique. A lot of people do what we do, right? But you've got to be solid on what you're going to consult around or what you're going to offer to clients. That's number one. Fortunately, through Dr. Adler's firm, I was given the opportunity to do a lot of work on assessment centers. In the old days, when we used to fly everybody into a single location, there'd be a bunch of coaches there, a bunch of participants, put 2.5 days worth of activities, feedback, all the stuff. At the end, comprehensive feedback. Bye bye, you're done. That's what it used to be. And it was great. And it really helped me hone my skills of observation, providing feedback, understanding what these things I'm observing, how they're connected to effective leadership or not. It really was an excellent training ground for fully understanding that. Um, and interestingly enough, talk about organic growth. That same client for whom we were delivering a lot of these around the world, after several 6 months or so to a year, they say, we love what you do. Your program is great. The feedback is excellent, but they're not getting any better, meaning their employees are not, there's no takeaway. So they said, we need you to coach them. And we're like, okay, we can do that. Now, this is so long ago. Coaching was a brand new area in business. A million years ago, there was an article on the HBR called "The Wild Wild West of Coaching," and that was us. But so we were figuring it out as we went along. I don't want to say making it up because we wanted to make sure we had good practice. We had a very clear guidelines between what was coaching, what was therapy, what can we touch, what can we not. Make sure that's very clear contracting. But this type of work, from my eye of watching what was going on, is started the growth there. Not the only ones, but we were some of the first there. So again, another offering grew out of a client need. And so we developed and built the skills as we went along. So if I think about sort of personal characteristics that will help someone be either a consultant on their own or a consultant within a firm, I think you have to be flexible and adaptable. Many times you have to pivot on a dime. There's going to be a change in the client needs. You've got to figure out how to do that. They'll say, "Can you do this?" And, sure, I can do this. And you behind the scenes, say, "How the heck am I to do that?" I have to go figure it out. Who do I talk to? What do we do? But that's still legitimate because you're going to do the good research and make sure that you're presenting good practice. Um, and hopefully a curious mind where you don't think, well, I know the thing I know and that's all I need to know. Well, good. If that's all you're going to do, you may stay in a particular job and crank out data analyses or crank out assessment tests or something of this nature, which is totally legitimate work. But if you're interested in growing and learning about our field, how to apply it, where you can do the most good, if you will, it really helps to be curious and willing to try new things out.
Yeah, I think that's all great advice for students as they're like looking to think about doing consulting, especially in the external sense. But I think that applies to the internal world too. I want to pick at a point you made there, Janice, because you mentioned about like a client saying like a tailoring to client needs and learning how to do something. Like something that I've always just wondered is like where's the line of like I will accept this role even though I might not have the experience in it, but I know I can learn it versus like I won't accept this role because I even though I could learn it, like I might not be doing it as effective as somebody else. Like where does that line kind of get drawn for you as a consultant?
That's an excellent question. And I think some people in their enthusiasm to take on new projects and new work may not um, be aware of that line and then get themselves in over their head, overpromise, underdeliver, and then they have that stain on their reputation and experience to have to deal with. As much as it's important to learn new things and be able to stretch your skills, I think you also have to know what you're good at and what you're capable of. Um, I had a very rigorous doctoral program. They put me through all the paces on all of my statistical learnings and so forth. It was painful, but I got through it, passed all my quals, did all my own analysis. It's not my strong suit. It's not my favorite thing to do. So if somebody would hand me a great big data set and to analyze this and say, find somebody else who's better skilled at this, because I know what my own limitations are. However, if it's developing a training program for leaders, even if the content is new to me, I can look up the content. I know how to deliver training content. I know how to coach people around various skills. Um, so that's kind of where I would say know your own real skill sets, honestly, not sugarcoating it and not self aggrandizing, and know your limitations. And what are you likely to be able to learn in the amount of time that you've got? Or maybe you say, okay, I can do. I had this interesting project a number of years ago where a colleague of mine was given a huge data set by a culture survey company, and um, it was massive. And she needed to be able to present the information to her senior leadership in incremental bits. And I was unfamiliar with this culture survey, but I do understand the notion of culture. I didn't have to do the data analytics, thank goodness. It was handed to us by that company. But I could help this person develop the PowerPoints, talk about the themes and the trends and so forth. So again, there was a nice demarcation on the ends of my capability, which was already taken care of, and where I could take over and add value and help my colleague. So I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Oh, yeah, I think it does. I also want to add that I feel like it adds to like just your overall well-being when you know what you're good at. I remember some advice told to me, and I really do think it's true, that if you find what you're good at, and use that to search what you want to do in your career, it's much better to do than finding just what you want to do. And I feel like at first it sounds like not as great, but when I really started thinking that way, I was like, oh, I'm good at doing this sort of task, and when I do it well, that makes me happier. I feel like as an IO research, that's kind of what you learn as well. And this is kind of what I'm going to pursue, and now I'm like happy doing what I'm doing. So that piece about you talking about knowing what you're good at, knowing your limitations is very important, especially for early practitioners to help kind of lead you in the right direction. Um, at least that's just what I think advice told me. I am a bit curious though on the more client side of your work coming from the IO background. Is that something you had to learn? Because personally, I feel like if I had to go into that more sales mindset, I'm like selling my work in that client side, like I would have no idea where to start. I was like, I don't even know how to like get this information across to the client. Um, where do you stand on that? How did you learn to do that?
Well, typically, most organizations and people in them are not open or view favorably a really hard sell. Um, However, if you're having a conversation in front of a client or with a client team, you want to find out what are the issues that they are dealing with, what might be the problem they are looking to solve, and do some digging around to figure out what's going on. Now, many times a client will come to a consultant and say, I need a such and such. I need a performance management system because this, that, and the other thing isn't going right. And you dig around a little bit more and you find that it isn't so much performance management in particular, but maybe they need leadership training so that leaders are better invested in coaching their people. And yes, the performance management can come out of that, but that's not the issue. So it's a matter of being able to unearth what the real need is for the company and then be able to match that. So it's a conversation. It's not necessarily hard sales, but it may be what is often been termed a consultative sales approach. What are the things that you're dealing with? What do you need to do? Have you considered doing these things? How can we be helpful? And then you kind of co-create their answer. I think that is more palatable to most people who are going to hire consultants. It's also a lot easier to feel comfortable doing because you're not like pushing sales. I mean, if you want to be a hardcore salesperson, great. There are plenty of opportunities to do that. Um, but it doesn't always work in this venue. It doesn't always work in this area, and it's certainly not what I've done because you know, I guess I could do it, and I know an awful lot about it, having done a lot of adjacent work with large sales teams. But it's not necessarily my favorite way to interact. I much rather partner with someone, co-create, figure out what the best answer is. How do we make a solution to what's keeping you or your CEO up at night?
The partnering aspect of that, I think, is really interesting because, like, as a consultant, you're external to the company, and it's hard to try and build that rapport or make yourself feel like almost an internal colleague. Has there ever been any challenges being the external person and trying to like navigate like the organizational politics or just the bureaucracy of it or whatever the case may be whenever you've tried to like gain entry and like you've been given a project? Like, have you had any trouble with that?
Oh yeah, it's a very common issue, especially being a small concern like myself. If you're a larger organization, you probably have a larger reputation in the field. There may be some contacts within the decision makers of those larger corporations who are familiar with the offerings of, fill in the blank consulting firm. Um, but the biggest challenge that I think I'm seeing, and I've been talking with some of my colleagues about this lately, is the whole procurement process is now very much involved in deciding who gets contracts and who does not. And that's an internal function to the corporation, which of course has sort of maybe a control function within that organization. They're trying to vet various providers to make sure not only ethical standards and things of this nature, but pricing and those sorts of things. So being able to navigate whatever the procurement process is has become more of a factor, I think, in winning these types of projects than they might have been years ago. Um, and that can be challenging because they've got a set thing that they want to do. They're trying to make things as consistent as they possibly can across vendors, get the best price, get the highest quality, and that can be a little difficult to operate within.
It's very interesting. That's like this is my favorite part about why we have this podcast. Like, I guess it makes sense, but like, unless someone told me like you, like, I never would have thought about that process about the contracting in organizations. That's it's honestly the first time I've heard about like that sort of process. Yes, we have a final project. I'm gonna quote that and put it on a sign. Just write Janis.
Oh no.
uh,
Okay.
but that's no, that's very is very interesting. Um, as we near the end of our recording, I wanted to finish off with one of our last questions that we ask all of our guests. I mean, you've kind of already given us so many great advice for students, but we were wondering if you had any general tips or advice for incoming IO students, or just early practitioners in general.
Well, I think it harkens back a little bit to what I said about really honing your expertise, and it doesn't have to be just one thing, but do have a set skill set that you are mastering through your training and through practice so that you have clear, reliable offerings to give. If you're interested in going into consulting, maybe the thing to do is to get a job either with a corporation internally first or with a consulting firm internally first, because they can show you the ropes of how these things are done, how the sausage is made, what's really involved, those things like procurement, those things like who do you talk to, who's the decision maker, how do you survive the constant change of organizational charts that happen in all organizations these days. It's I would think there's a good sort of safe training ground for new career or brand new IO psychologists to get that type of experience, and then say, well, can I do well here in this internal type of role, even though I'm consulting either to my own organization or through my organization to large corporations. You get to hone your skills. And know how to be client facing, know what to say, what not to say, understand the politics that you're dealing with across the board. It's probably a good safety net. to make sure that you're getting your skills down solid. And then after that, decide, is this something I want to try to do on my own or with partners? Or am I going to do really well here learning with these other colleagues I have?
I think that's wonderful advice. And I know Joe and I are both students. Hearing that, it's really cool to think about trying to build your skills to help your career in a specific, like more, because like you always think like, okay, like maybe I'll take like a generalist role as when I get out of graduate school, try a lot of different things, see what I think seems interesting, and then dive down that path later on. And that kind of, I think, echoes the same sentiment that you're saying there, Janice, where it's like, okay, you figure out what you like, and then you get really good at it, and then you master it, and then you make that your living. And I'll give like a little personal anecdote. I remember when I was in high school and I was talking to my grandfather about what I wanted to do with my career, and he's a doctor. He's like, Brandon, do you think like I wanted to be a doctor? He's like, no. He was like, I did not want to be a doctor. I didn't want to do this. He was like, I had a rock band. I wanted to be a musician, but like that doesn't pay the bills. And he said, but the thing that made me happy was being good at something. And he was like, and when I got good at being a doctor, that made me happy. And like Joe's kind of echoing that as well earlier about like finding that internal motivation when you're good at something. But I think that that all speaks to what you were saying there, Janice. It's definitely good advice for students who are trying to figure out what they want to do. And there's so many options in IO, but like finding the one that suits you, and whatever that's going to be different for everybody, but finding that one that suits you, I think, could be really helpful for people figuring out their careers.
And I think one can find that out actually maybe by taking a generalist role sometimes. If you're really unclear and everything seems fascinating and equally interesting, which is wonderful, get a job where you have the opportunity to do everything for a while and see if you really enjoy them as much as you do. Or is this something you're really uniquely called to want to learn more about? So that can be a great overview, a start to figure out where do I want to specialize.
Yeah, especially right out of grad school. Even if you're late in your career, like why not? What's the worst thing that could happen like 2 years in? You just switch. Like it's that's the beauty of it.
That's right.
But thank you for your advice and for just coming on our podcast. It's a great episode. I'm very excited for people to hear about it, especially those interested in consulting. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you so much, guys. It was really nice of you to offer to have me do this. I hope people find anything I have to say useful. That always surprises me. But you'd think after all these years I'd get used to it, but because that's what I do for a living. But besides the point, I hope it was helpful. And again, thanks for the privilege of being able to participate.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll definitely, hopefully, see you at the next Metro events.
Yep. Looking
Yes,
forward to
definitely.
it. Very good. Thank you.
Another great episode, Joe. I love when we get to talk to external people to compare it to like the internal roles that we hear about. I think it's always really interesting to compare and contrast.
Absolutely, especially Janice. She has a long list of consulting experience that we actually didn't even get into, like the other
No.
companies that she worked for. Um, for our listeners, you should definitely take a look at her LinkedIn. It's BTS, Aon,
Concentric.
Concentric. What is? I wish I still had my tab open. I would have looked. But it's such a long list that we definitely recommend looking at it, reaching out, and asking her some of the questions that we didn't get to ask her ourselves.
Yeah, definitely reach out to her, ask her questions. I've had the privilege of getting to hear her talk twice now about her career, and each time I learned something different. So, like, I think that if you want to talk to her or just like learn about the consulting world, there are so many students out there who want to try out consulting, and I think it's such a great path. And it's just something that you've got to hear about from people who have already done it to really know what's right for you.
Yep. Yeah. Make sure take some notes on this recording alone for your eventual consulting careers. Thank you as always for everybody for listening, and we will catch you next Friday for the next episode.